Hi, and welcome to Hill and Ponton's VA Disability Blog. I'm Natalia Joffrey, the company COO.
And I'm attorney Allison Reddick.
And as you can see, we're continuing to do our part with social distancing, what we keep referring to as the new normal, right, Allison?
Yes.
So obviously, once all of this madness passes, we do hope to resume our usual format where we'll be together and be able to actually see each other and interact personally. But for now, we feel like this information is just too important to stop putting out there. So we're adapting just like the rest of the world. Today, we're actually going to be talking about something that's pretty in current events. I hear a lot about this on the news. I've read a lot of articles. I know that a lot of information keeps coming out about burn pits.
Yes.
So Allie, could you please tell everyone first of all, what a burn pit is?
So a burn pit is exactly what it sounds like. It's an area of a military base where waste is burned in an open air environment. In Afghanistan and Iraq during those wars, they needed to get rid of waste quickly. So this was the easiest way to get rid of large amounts of waste in a timely fashion. It's not like a barrel, though, that you throw waste in and set on fire. These burn pits were acres large. The largest
Wow.
was about 20 acres, where there would be open fire throughout and just pummels of smoke.
Wow. And when you're saying waste, I mean, are we talking about, human waste, or are we talking about like anything that they just didn't need anymore?
Anything you can think of was probably burned in burn pits. Human waste, medical waste, body parts, ammunition,
Wow.
chemicals, metals, plastics, fuels. So when these things are burned, all of the particles are released into the air. So a multitude of things were burned.
Super toxic. And so, what chemicals, because I know you mentioned that, and we know inherently that whenever anything, any sort of material is normally burnt, toxins are released. So which carcinogens or which chemicals are directly correlated normally with burn pits?
So what's really interesting is that dioxin, which is associated with Agent Orange, is
Yeah.
one of the chemicals that was burned, or that is released when plastics or ammunition, things like that are burned. So there's hydrocarbons, there's dioxins, there's all of these chemicals that are released, which are connected with a lot of conditions that veterans can develop.
And that's interesting because you said these burn pits were used relatively recently. You're talking about Afghanistan and
Mhm.
countries in the Middle East, but yet we always associate Agent Orange with Vietnam, right?
Yes. So
So,
this is like the kind of the new Agent Orange.
wow.
Burn pits have been used in the Gulf War. More frequently, they were used in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Hmm.
And in 2019, the Defense Department finally acknowledged, you know what, the things that we're burning, they're toxic and we shouldn't use burn pits anymore. So they started to phase them out. But there's a caveat and a loophole in that if there's no other feasible way to get rid of waste, burn pits can still be used. So I think as of now, known, there are still 9 burn pits in use in Syria, Afghanistan, and I believe there's one in Egypt. So even though they tried to phase them out, some of them are still being used.
Wow. So they're still actively doing this practice of the burn pits. So who's exposed to them? Is it a particular group of people? Is someone in charge of the burn pit? Is it a particular job or?
I would say every base or almost every base in Iraq and Afghanistan post 9/11 had a burn pit. Up until about 2009, 2010 is when they tried to start phasing them out. So anyone who was on that base was most likely exposed. Your
Wow.
exposure depends on how close you were, the winds, which way the smoke would blow. But speaking to veterans, it was just like a thick cloud of black smoke that would always be present 24 hours a day because constantly things were being burned.
Wow. So which health conditions are associated with these burn pits?
So since this is newer, we don't have a lot of research on it, but definitely respiratory issues, pulmonary disabilities, autoimmune problems. Like I said, dioxin is released, so a lot of various types of cancers that are associated with Agent Orange can also be associated with burn pits. I mean, you're breathing it in on your skin, it's on your skin, your central nervous system, cardiovascular. It can affect so many different parts of the body.
It's so interesting too. A couple of the conditions that you mentioned are people who are now the most susceptible to COVID, right? Or could be
Yes.
the pulmonary and
Mhm.
the immunosuppressed, and
Yes.
those are two of the conditions you mentioned. So God forbid you have these conditions and you contract COVID. I
Mhm.
mean, it could basically be a death sentence for
Yeah, it
you.
can absolutely make you more
Wow.
susceptible and make it more difficult for your body to be able to handle the virus.
Okay. Well, we know we talked a little bit about Agent Orange earlier, and kind of like the parallels with it. And we know that with Agent Orange, people sometimes didn't, appear to have conditions or develop symptoms until many years later. So I guess it begs the question: how soon can health conditions start to appear after you've been exposed to a burn pit?
So, since the research is limited, we don't know how exposure to burn pits is going to affect you 5 years from now, 10, 20. But I think immediately within service, that exposure, you can definitely develop symptoms as
Hmm.
well as, a year after, years after. It's like Agent Orange, where in some cases, your symptoms can be. Um, soon after, where like with your skin conditions with Agent Orange, but then also years later you can develop symptoms as well and conditions due to the exposures because of the chemicals.
Wow. Is Gulf War syndrome as a result of burn pits, or is that a different thing?
No, Gulf War syndrome is separate. Gulf War syndrome is basically when veterans who served in Iraq and Kuwait have certain symptoms that aren't explained by any specific medical condition.
Hmm.
So that's separate from anything being exposed to burn pit. Now, were they probably exposed to burn pits as well? Absolutely. But for the burn pits, you can pinpoint what from that exposure potentially caused your condition, whereas Gulf War syndrome, that's the point, is that you rule out all of these conditions and it's basically a medically undiagnosed condition because of your symptoms.
Right, right. Since you did mention exposure a couple of times, how do you prove your exposure to a burn pit if you're trying to establish a claim?
So I think if you served in Iraq or Afghanistan, um, most of those bases, if on your in your service records, it states that you were on at a specific base, there's probably going to have been a burn pit there.
Hmm.
If there's an issue of you being able to prove that you I think the issue would be more of how much exposure you had to the burn pit. So,
Hmm.
where you were located, what your job was, were you outside? Were you close to the burn pit within, a certain range? Were you breathing in the chemicals or in the smoke? Like to the point where it's like burning your eyes and affecting you to that extent. I think that's more or less how you approve how much you were exposed rather than
Right.
actually.
And we've heard stories, right? I mean, we've first hand witness accounts where they'll tell us, I was throwing chairs in this thing and I was, throwing boxes of medical supplies and whatever. Like they would
Uh,
tell us stuff like that, where it's easier for them to burn things than have to move them. And I guess that's what people sometimes don't realize is that the relocation of equipment, sometimes it's easier just to burn it. But it's not, you don't necessarily have to have been the one throwing equipment into the fire in order to have been exposed to the burn pit and its effects, right? I mean,
exactly. I think majority of the people on the base were probably exposed to it. It's just varying levels of exposure. Now, the people who were throwing in the unexploded ordnance and the dead bodies and the plastics and things like that, of course, they're going to have higher exposure. But even if you didn't do that, you definitely were exposed to it.
Yeah. What evidence would you say would help a burn pit claim?
So, burn pit claims are difficult because there is no presumptive for it yet.
Hmm.
Like Agent Orange, if you served in Vietnam, you are presumed exposed to Agent Orange and you have certain conditions that you get presumptive service connection for. So, since there is no presumptive exposure for burn pits, you have to prove it on a case by case basis. Um, Evidence, I would say, would be statements to state how close you were to the burn pits and what you remember from it and the smells and what you saw, where you worked, if you were inside, you were outside. Some people would have to wear like coverings over their face because they were so exposed and irritated by the smoke.
Hmm.
Buddy statements of people you worked with.
I was
As
just going to ask you that because you always tell us about buddy statements.
Yes,
So
buddy
they would
statements.
work here. Hmm.
Absolutely. Lay evidence, always has to be considered. And then the thing with burn pit cases is you're going to need a nexus statement from a doctor. So you're going to really need someone who's going to do the research and understand how exposure to certain chemicals leads to certain conditions.
And just real quick, for people who haven't heard us talk about these before, can you just tell everyone really quick what a buddy statement is? It's pretty basic.
Yeah, so a buddy statement would be anyone that you've served with, where they provide their statement. I served with so and so, and I remember that we were ordered, once a week to throw all of this trash into the burn pits. It can also be lay statements from family members or friends who you told about these things.
Why are VA burn pit claims often mishandled?
So I think they're mishandled because there's a lack of information and a lack of understanding. I mean, it took years and years and years for the VA to understand Agent Orange, and we're still dealing with those cases today when that was a long time ago. And this is more present. This is the new um, exposure that it causes so many different conditions. So I really think it's a lack of information. And when the raters and the decision review officers review cases, they kind of have a structured guide that they go by. So basically, since there's no presumptives, they kind of just deny it because they're like, oh, there's no connection. We don't have any information about burn pits, so we're going to deny it. Yeah.
Sort of like a when in doubt, deny, right? It's sort of almost
Yes.
the VA motto, and there is so much unknown about this.
But I
Go ahead.
definitely think even though there's a lot of unknown about it, you should definitely file a claim because eventually this is going to have more research and be developed to the point, that Agent Orange was, or even for Blue Water veterans. It took a long time, but now they have um, they have the ability to get compensation benefits. So if you served in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere where you were exposed to burn pits and
Hmm.
you think that you have a condition that was caused by the burn pit, you should definitely file a claim. Is it going to get denied? Most likely, but you continue to appeal, have a doctor provide a nexus statement to show how that exposure caused your condition, or you can always reach out to us and we can give advice and help with our resources as well.
That's great. All right, wonderful. Thanks, Allison. We
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Of course.
Um, we hope you'll join us again. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to visit our website or call our office. Thank you.
Thank you.